Carbon steel chef's knives have a certain mystique. Their reputation among chefs is that they're superior because they can supposedly take on a finer, sharper edge. We decided to get to the bottom of this. Are they really better than regular stainless steel chef's knives? Carbon steel knives have been around a long time. They went out of favor several decades ago when stainless steel came along. Stainless basically means rust resistant, while carbon steel gets a blackish coloring as you use it, and it rusts if it's not kept clean and dry. You shouldn't leave a carbon steel knife in the sink or with food sitting on it. And some chefs even wipe the blade between each cut. So they're certainly much more fussy to maintain than stainless steel, but if they really performed much better, they might be worthwhile. We bought 8 carbon steel knives, 4 Western and 4 Japanese, and they're priced from about $80 to $300. We asked a mix of trained chefs and home cooks, men and women, to take each knife through a series of tests, mincing parsley, dicing onions, quartering butternut squash, and butchering whole raw chickens. Then we evaluated each knife's handle, blade, and overall design. Now, just as with any type of knife, comfort is a factor. Handles that are too sharp or narrow stressed our hands. If they're too long, they got in the way. The best ones had nice smooth handles that gave us multiple grip options, so everybody's hands felt comfortable and secure. Next, we focused on the business end, the blade. A really sharp, agile blade moves through food with less force and more precision. And that feeling of sharpness is determined by 2 factors. First, how thin the edge is. The V-shaped cutting edge on the blade is measured by angle, and we found that the narrower that V, the better. Narrower blades slid through food rather than forcing it apart like a wedge. And it turns out the knives we liked the best were very narrow, and they're sharpened to an angle of just 10 to 15 degrees on either side of the blade. The ones we liked least were wider, at 20 degrees per side. The second part of sharpness is strength, and that's determined by the kind of steel used and how the blade is heat treated. Think about baking a cake. The choice of your ingredients is important, but so is how you mix the batter, how hot the oven is, and how long it's baked. All of those things are going to affect the finished cake. Now, knife makers wouldn't tell us any details of their recipes, so we started by looking at each knife's Rockwell rating. The Rockwell scale is a hardness scale, and it measures the strength of the metal. Sure enough, we noticed the higher the Rockwell, meaning the harder the steel, the better the knife performed in our tests. Next, we took our knives over to MIT's Department of Materials Science and Engineering, where they used a high-powered digital microscope to zoom in on the edge of what our testers said were the sharpest and the dullest knives. The contrast was astounding. Under the microscope, the dullest knife, a French blade from Sabatier, looked battered and rounded like a weathered mountain ridge. The sharpest, highest-ranking knife was designed by master bladesmith Bob Kramer and made by Zwilling J.A. Henckels. Now, under the microscope, the Kramer knife looked like fishing wire. It was straight and narrow as the tip of a needle. So no wonder the tester said the Sabatier felt like cutting with a spoon, and the Kramer knife felt samurai sharp. All this taught us one really important lesson. All carbon steel knives are not the same. It really depends on how it's made. We did choose a favorite carbon steel knife, the Kramer by Henckels, but wouldn't you know, that's the one that cost $300. So we couldn't help but wonder how it compared to our longtime favorite stainless steel knife, the Victorinox 8-inch Swiss Army Fibrox chef's knife. It's only $40. So for a final test, we pitted brand new copies of the Kramer knife and the Victorinox against one another in a series of challenges. Now, out of the box, both were equally sharp. So to see how long their edges would last, we put a cutting board on a scale to guarantee that each cut would have exactly 20 pounds of pressure. And then we made rocking cuts as if we were chopping vegetables. And then we slashed sheets of paper to test their sharpness after every 10 strokes so we could track the changes. Now, 7 hours and 5,000 cuts per knife later, those 2 blades were still as sharp as the first cut. So next we used each knife to butcher 5 whole raw chickens and chop 5 rock-hard butternut squash. Then we asked testers to slice tomatoes and rate which blade felt sharper. And again, it was nearly impossible to tell. So we brought out the bane of knives everywhere, a glass cutting board. Glass absolutely wrecks blades. 10 strokes each, and the knives still moved through the paper, but not as smoothly. By 50 strokes, they both started to make jagged, uneven cuts through the paper, but the Kramer still felt slightly sharper. At 100 strokes, the Kramer was definitely sharper, but only by a little margin. Both knives were still able to slice through onions very easily. So do we recommend a carbon steel knife? Yes. If you're willing to keep it dry and you have the cash, the Kramer is a showstopper. It's beautifully crafted, it's visually stunning, and it's really fun to use. We found a cheaper carbon steel option, which is our best buy. For $98.50, the Togiharu virgin carbon steel Gyuto is slightly less sharp, but it still wowed our testers. But for just $39.99, the Victorinox surprised us again. For everyday use, this knife is pretty amazing. So how could this cheap little knife keep up? It's all about the grain of the steel. Tight, finely grained steel can be honed to a thinner edge without breaking, and it makes the whole knife stronger. The theory is that carbon steels are finer grained than stainless because the chromium in stainless steel tends to combine with carbon and create these large brittle clumps in the grain of the knife called chromium carbides. They're microscopic clumps, but they poke out of the edge and they're easily dinged out of place and they leave a pit on the cutting surface. They also weaken the knife overall because they form larger grains. So we took the Victorinox and the Kramer knives to the Boston University Photonics Center, where they put them inside their $500,000 scanning electron microscope. Under extreme magnification, the Kramer Henckels knife had a nice tight grain, but so did the Victorinox. We found chromium carbides in the Victorinox, but they were small. They were not large enough to weaken the blade. So we concluded that some of today's knife makers, like Victorinox, have found ways to solve the problem of large chromium carbides to make stronger, more uniform stainless steels. And in the end, when the results are that close, the bottom line for us has to be practical. We're still going to use our Victorinox stainless knife. It's low maintenance and cheap, and it's the best tool in our kitchen.